All right. We're live. We're getting going, which is great. Welcome everybody. So glad that you're here. My name is Christian Anibarro. I'm the Director of Operational Effectiveness at Intentional Futures, and I'm super excited for this next hour. Glad that you're with us. We're going to be exploring a simple and I would say really powerful, almost transformational topic that the headline here is how do we move from KPIs to KBIs? And the way that we think about it is how can KBIs, these key behavior indicators, make the most out of KPIs and the change that you're up to. So we're going to be taking a look at that. We're going to be taking a look at the impact it has as you're beginning to adopt, implement, integrate AI. So lots to get to, and not enough time always. But before we do, we've got a small group here assembled and excited to be able to have a conversation together and talk through some of what we're going to be introducing today. So why don't we go around the horn here, introduce ourselves, say a little bit about our organization, and then we'll jump into things. Colin, can I start with you?
Yeah, Colin Smith, co-founder of Execnow. We've been around for a little over 2 years and support a variety of clients, both in biotech, AI, as well as renewables, help them with talent acquisition.
Awesome. Kahlil Dumas, co-founder at Execnow. Execnow is a next-gen leadership and talent partner for high-growth startups. So to Colin's point, we see everything from seed to IPO. And so really excited to jump in today, especially through the lens of AI.
Excellent. Glad that you guys are able to partner with us on this. I'm excited for the conversation. Michael, why don't you share about you and a little bit more about Intentional Futures?
You bet. I'm Michael Dix. I founded Intentional Futures 15 years ago, and our first project was for Bill Gates directly out of this private office. He's still one of our best clients. We do quite a bit of work for him and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as large and small nonprofit and for-profit organizations. Technology is usually central, and we help organizations rapidly learn and explore what's possible, often through technology. Develop dynamic strategies that can help them navigate complexity and figure out what to do and as they pursue goals and growth and success, and then also transform themselves, which is what today's conversation is most directly applicable to.
Love it. Great. And last but not least, again, my name is Christian Anibarro, and I work at Intentional Futures as the Director of Operational Effectiveness. And as Michael said, help bring these strategies to life and help move them forward, because we know that's not easy. And I want to start there because there are so many challenges that we know leaders face. We experience them in our own organizations. I see everybody's nodding their heads, but also, those that we partner with to serve. And those challenges are really great, specifically around leading strategic change. And I think that's really like the right place to start for us today. And, I'm going to get some slides up here going and just make sure that you can kind of read with us for a moment, because I'm just going to share a couple of what's up here that we've heard, and then just want to make sure I'm hearing also from, my guests with me today. But, at the start, one of the biggest things that folks say is when we're engaging in beginning to look at and think about how is AI going to change what we're doing? How are we going to engage in the kind of change needed to shift the outcomes, maybe transform a business model? Obviously, the first thing is, how do we overcome this massive resistance that folks might have? It's not just resistance, it's fear about what's going to happen if/when AI is going to be adopted and implemented. And if you can get past that, you've still got this massive hurdle that lays there, which is how do we even change the behaviors? If we're going to be much more adaptive, if we're going to be much more nimble, much more cross-functional, if we're going to have to address feedback in a more predictive or faster way, how do we get folks to engage in daily actions that are different than maybe how we do it today? And I'll go one step further. Folks are asking us, so how do you even I don't know how to change behavior, but how do I even define it and track whether or not the behaviors are actually changing to realize those outcomes? So there's a lot there when we think about the challenges that we know when we're working with leaders they're facing. Kahlil, Colin, what else would you add?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. To be frank, KBIs was something that we had exposure to but didn't have language for, and I think Intentional Futures really did a good job of giving us some language for that. Because what we see a lot of the time is, most leaders are measuring outcomes, which makes a lot of sense. Very few are measuring the behaviors that create them. And so even this week, we had onboarded a new client who was looking to fill engineering roles. The behaviors that they were exhibiting to go find these roles, right, were a little bit of like a shotgun wedding approach, right? We're going to put this ad up and we're going to sift through all of these candidates. kind of where we came in to change the behavior was having this weekly calibration between the hiring managers and our firm, which were way more strategic, showing them things like a trade-off matrix, showing them archetypes, right? That change in behavior to having that weekly commitment to a meeting was able to vastly reduce hiring time and also just increase hiring velocity because the org felt like they had all the information to make the right hire. And so that's just one example, but really it comes down to that small shift, which is starting to analyze some of those behaviors.
Yeah, that's great. And just to interject, and as I'm listening to you, it is a small shift, and we're going to talk about that. It's always small, but has a really big impact. And I heard you talk about behaviors, but one of the things you specifically mentioned, we're going to bring this out, is a practice that they engaged in, this practice. And that's what's really reinforcing the behavior change, which is important. Sorry, Colin, anything else you would add, or Michael, before we move on?
Yeah, I think one thing that we've seen time and time again with COOs and CEOs is this idea of they're tracking KPIs, but they're not sure what movement is underneath those KPIs. So what kind of behavior gets the team moving to the objectives they have. So oftentimes when we're consulting with CEOs or COOs, they have dashboards full of KPIs, and half the time they're not understanding what's driving those motions. So I think, to our point in this conversation, KBIs can help fill that gap where we start to understand what's pushing us forward to those KPIs.
Yeah, right on. And we'll get into it. Part of it is, you're rewarded for results. Your job in many ways is to drive results. But the shift that we're talking about here could be, how do you drive performance, which is a little different. So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, sure. Let me just add one more thought in the mix, kind of stating the obvious here, but every leader is frustrated in many ways about their inability to get their organization to shift or pursue something that they want. The saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's a little trite right now, but it's incredibly true, and it resonates because you might have the best strategy in the world, but if you can't get your organization to kind of understand it, pursue it, and figure out how to kind of learn and adjust as they go, you're going to be frustrated and you won't achieve what you're trying to do. And so what we're talking about here in part is about redefining kind of culture as something very visible and concrete that is behavior, and saying it's not something you just need to hope for. It's something you're actually designed for and measure your progress for and understand how it drives performance. So that's a large part of what we're talking about here today.
And I think that's key. I think we undervalue culture and what that actually means. When I see culture and hear culture, a lot of it is like a tagline or something that just, organizations are repeating, hoping that it's actually true without actually doing the discovery work to understand what is my culture, especially as it relates to AI. What's allowed our organization to really aggressively move toward AI to improve efficiencies and our own KPIs is we've already established a culture of innovation, of trying new things, of failing, of learning from lessons. And I wish I could say that's the standard, but that's something that we're helping organizations build towards. So, Michael, I think that's such a great place to focus, is culture and understanding and defining the reality of your culture. Because I have a feeling a lot of leaders are very futuristic with how they think about their culture as well.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback off that, one other thing from a talent acquisition side, if you want the best talent in the market, they want a great culture. That's just not something you can substitute. So oftentimes we find pay packages that are really rewarding for executives and leaders, but if they're missing that cultural piece, that attrition rises as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%, which is a bit about what we're going to be focusing on today, because as you're saying, culture tends to be a strategic priority, but it's rarely an operational one. And I don't think it's because the will isn't there. As you mentioned, I don't think folks always know how to do it, right? It's the vehicle that tends to be missing. So we can't solve everything today, but there's three things we are going to do in the time that we have. So one is we're going to introduce this concept of key behavior indicators. So we're going to, unpack this a bit more and talk about how can it improve organizational adaptability, help you get insight into the performance, what's moving those results. And I think that's really important. Here we're going to talk about, well, how do you actually embed them into the daily experience? So that's always something that's important when you're moving some kind of large change, is how do you even embed the KPIs to make sure that you're moving forward, but how do we actually embed these behavioral indicators so that they're actually owned by team members? That's a big lift in and of itself. And then last but not least, and we're going to touch on this. So, and Colin and Kahlil, you actually mentioned some practices. So what might be those high impact practices? This is all about, we talk about the ABC model. So antecedents, behaviors, and we're talking about consequences. It's all about consequences and reinforcement. They are 4 times more powerful than anything else that you can do to actually drive behavior change. And we'll talk about that. So, so this is going to be really exciting. And I think as we do this, I think, we just want to start by stating the obvious, that strategic change, that, what's happening now in terms of the excitement around AI, the disruption, it's a challenge. It's just difficult. And I guess I would start by just saying, if you can get past the technical aspects of the change, which are going to be difficult, if you can get past making sure you have quality data, that you've thought about your data preparation, that you have thought about how it is you're going to be, engaging in some kind of scale, all of those pieces, but, minds can be put on that. They're solvable. You still have the massive hurdle of this cultural change, because technology tends to be that. Technology change tends to be a culture change. So how do we do that? And I say that because, and I just want to have a conversation here about this for a moment. When we take a look at what's happening for organizations, for teams, for leaders that are trying to spearhead this change, we tend to actually hear some of the same things that they say are some of the shortcomings in terms of why things aren't moving. And this is all on the, the change side of things. We hear things like, well, we didn't really have a clear vision. Or we didn't communicate it enough. You need to communicate. We maybe didn't actually include the employees in some of the change in which, they were going to be a part of that we should have. We could have had better training, et cetera. And these sound right. And I think they're important, but they don't sound, to us, they didn't sound like they were the root cause. Do these sound like the kinds of things, that you all are hearing in terms of what folks are typically trying to do to address the change? This is a big change.
Yeah, I mean, I think these symptoms are spot on, and I think the challenge is it's a bit of a rubber band ball. I think there's a lot of these different forces at play, not to mention all the different personalities and people that are involved or not involved, which I think is a really key point here. I think just giving an example with some of the workflows that us internally and the way we're approaching AI is, we wanted to start at the co-founder level. We wanted to start with exercises of how do we change and adapt to using this new technology, right? What are some of the pain points that we're feeling? What are we seeing, right? We started there, and then we started to strategically bring some of our team members into that fold to get their perspectives on it. So I think these symptoms are spot on. I think there's obviously a level of shame or a level of guilt with not kind of admitting that these are problems. I think that goes back to culture and having the culture of being able to be transparent and open, even if it's not comfortable. So I think these symptoms are spot on, but I know this list is probably 4x. I think there's probably more things in here, but I think these are the top 6 that I've seen, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when we did our desk research, when we, went through and had interviews, these things kept coming up over and over and over again, which I thought was fascinating. And I wouldn't, refute that these things aren't important. They're really important to be able to get folks to engage in adopting the surface level change, right? That needs to be there. So I wouldn't say that these things are necessarily wrong, but it's interesting in the way we think about them. And Michael, you and I have been in conversations because one of the things that became an aha for us, a point of view, was that these are symptoms. They need to be addressed. But one of the things we realized is that they aren't really the root cause of what we're talking about, which isn't just surface level adoption. It's really about the long-term behavioral change, right? So that's really where we're at. And that's what we're talking about here, is there's something missing, something completely different, that even if you did all of those things well, you still might not be driving that long-term behavior change, So that's what we want to be honing in on is what's missing, am I hitting the nail on the head there, Michael? I just want to make sure I'm checking in with you, before we get into this and talk about like what KBIs can do for you.
You are, for sure. So let's get into explaining some of these concepts and insights, and then we can connect it.
Perfect. So there's 2 things that we saw in particular. So one is that we started to see leaders and teams approach some of this complex change using what we would think of as causal tools. And so this is a really interesting example here. And When Michael, you and I were taking a look at things, we just to make sure we're level setting. So really quickly here, an example of, a causal system, a watch, a car engine, what does that mean? These are the kind of systems that if they break, you can fix them, right? You can take them to an expert. They can diagnose, they can root cause, problem solving, come up with a work plan to actually fix these items. And if you think about what that looks like inside of your organization, that might sound like things like implementing your software, not developing it, not getting folks to adopt the behaviors, but implementing it. So getting the requirements, walking through, coordinating the implementation. There's a lot of moving parts. You're going to need experts for that. It might be, running a training plan, running a hiring plan. But these are knowable, they're fixable. And you're going to want to take let's do a root cause, let's do a work plan approach to that. But that's not what we were seeing when we were taking a look at the kind of goals and issues that folks are dealing with, especially if we're talking about implementing AI. Complex change is different, right? So Michael, you and I have talked about this. Examples of complex systems would be the weather, would be a garden. It would be a 6-year-old, anything like that. So a community, these are different. They are dispositional in nature, meaning that they have a general direction that they're headed, but they surprise us. They are going to continuously evolve. And here's the most important thing about that kind of a system. They can't be fixed. So you can't fix the weather. You cannot fix a garden. And when you think about, well, what is the kind of change that folks are engaging in the organizational business sphere, that would sound like anything that's trying to improve the customer experience. It's complex. Employee experience. Anything that has to do with improving safety, anything that has to do with improving productivity, et cetera. Anything around that realm is complex. And so if you're taking an approach where you're trying to come up with a work plan and execute it like a project plan, it's not going to work. And yet that's what we saw happen quite a bit. And, irregardless of how well you tackled that communication, those clear business objectives, you still were running into this problem where things were dynamic. And if you think about the implementation of AI and implementation of any technology, what we've been noticing and what we've been talking about here is you're going to have to change your behaviors, and behaviors are dynamic, right? So, that's one of the first problems that we recognize is we needed to make sure that we were teasing apart when people said, oh my gosh, Michael, what we're engaging with here is complicated, it's complex. We needed them to really make that distinction and understand, well, what are you dealing with first? Because it's going to change how we approach it, right?
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think this is an incredibly common reflex leaders have. And I saw this during my many years at Microsoft, for example, and with many of our clients, when they're struggling with getting their teams to perform a certain way or rise up to a certain challenge, they treat it like it's a causal issue. And if they had smarter people or the right person in a role at the right organizational structure or one more research study, they could fix it and then be on track. And they never could get there. And then they do another reorg or another training program and things like that. And the problem is they're treating something that is very human and social and unknowable and surprising and unpredictable like a machine that can be fully understood and kind of optimized and fixed. And that's not the way things work. But if they had a different disposition, you could actually get greater performance, and you're kind of optimizing and learning and adjusting as you go. But not enough leaders understand the distinction and thus know how to show up for their teams.
Yeah, I think, Michael, one thing you're touching on and what we've noticed with clients that has been the real unlock is creating a shared behavior. So what happens at a lot of organizations, especially when it comes to implementation of AI, is that we see throughout companies it's being leveraged different platforms by different organizations, different people, not as a team, not as a shared behavior. And that's something that I think really KPIs can stick out and really point to, where that instead of a top-down approach to leveraging these platforms, it really needs to be something that's a shared behavior trait.
Yep, totally. And I think the beauty of today's conversation is these things can feel inchoate and vague and impossible to manage. So you can just say, well, this is just, it's people, or we're just going to keep grinding towards something. And the reality is it actually can be managed more actively. You just need a different disposition and different tools.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we see, just to, kind of bookend this, is We know that when you're going to introduce, a new technology, it's going to come with a, new set of behaviors. The causal approach would be to implement training. And I'm not saying the upskilling isn't important. It's a piece of it. And this is kind of one of the things that I'm going to say that's obvious and known, and yet it's something that hasn't been done well, which is why we think KBIs are so important. Is it's not enough to be able to introduce maybe the new way of doing a task or a new way of thinking about something or a new set of behaviors. It's about how are we going to institute a new set of practices? How are we going to create the environment and seed it in a way that's going to nurture some willingness to take some of this on. And so that's what we see here is that folks are typically trying to implement something instead of actually shifting the way in which they're going to engage their teams to continuously change with that. And so this is that second piece, because these things go together. And you mentioned it earlier, Kahlil. So one of the things we see is that when folks are trying to measure that change, they tend to focus. We talk about the difference between performance and results, right? Results is what you achieve, performance or the actions you take to achieve that. And yet folks understand that distinction, but when you ask them what metric you use to measure both, they always come up with the same metric. It's an outcome metric, it's an OKR, an objective key results, or it's a KPI, key performance indicator. And what does that measure? It measures your level of quality, your costs, your productivity, your delivery, your engagement. It can only tell you what is happening, but it doesn't give you any insight into like how it's actually occurring. And I think that's a really big miss. So that's, for us, that was the moment where we said, okay, we are not seeing how communicative, how collaborative, how transparent folks are, if that's something that's needed. So what would it look like to make that come out? And so that's the key behavior indicator that we had seen some organizations using, some effectively, some not very effectively, and said, okay, what would that look like to really put some thinking behind and really open up the opportunity for organizations to engage in? And a KBI is really important because what it measures is the consistency of certain actions that are taken over time, which is a little bit different. And that's the example you were giving us earlier, Kahlil, is give us, an opportunity to measure the consistency. And if there's a consistency happening there, then it's going to open up a link to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So that's really important. So I just want to call that out. And I'm just going to make sure I share one more piece here, because once we started to clue in on what does a good KBI look like and how is it being used and how can organizations use this effectively, it became obvious that it does three things. It helps really define, if we know what the outcome we're trying to achieve is, what are those key behaviors, those 20%? We're big on the 80-20 rule. So the 20% of actions create 80% of the result. What are those 20% of behaviors? They're going to push 80% of that outcome, right? Because we can't introduce 100 new behaviors. Folks won't be able to do that. So what are those 20% of behaviors? Let's define them. Then let's find out how consistently they're happening in our organization today. Folks often want a baseline on what are the behaviors today. And one of the things we realized is that's actually not helpful. What is helpful are what are the behaviors that you need and how consistently are those happening today. And then it gives you an opportunity, and we're going to unpack this with you, to begin to visualize and see then what are the practices that exist today to reinforce it, or what are the practices that are needed. And that in that simple example that you gave, Kahlil, that's what that's what KBI begins to do at scale, which is like really important.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. I mean, I wish I knew this 10 years ago when I would watch leaders kind of get upset that KPIs weren't being hit. Turns out their teams didn't even know, one, what to measure or what behaviors they needed to be doing to make those KPIs successful. And that comes back down to, again, Colin's point, which was this top-down approach. The C-suite understood what those folks should be doing, but the rest of the team didn't. One of the examples I want to give, which is back to our own organization, is trying to give time back to our employees and our co-founders as well, me and Colin. One thing we're implementing and have implemented is post-call recap. So you think about how many meetings you have in a day and how many post emails you have to send after those meetings. So in order for us to do that well, the KBI we needed to identify was what percentage of meetings are people actually recording. That is what would have led to the failure of not being able to adopt this post-email automation. So what this would do was it would take the meeting recording and it would draft an email. So at the end of your day, you'd have 5 email drafts that all you had to do is review and hit send, right? I could have just said, hey guys, we're implementing this new system. It's going to be set up, go off and run, which is what most organizations would have done. They wouldn't have broken down and said, hey, you actually have a requirement now to disclose that you're recording every meeting for efficiencies, to get approval for that, and then for us to go back and measure and see who's actually recording the meetings. And then from that, right, once we're able to identify, okay, 85% of our team are recording meetings now, then we can measure the KPI of time saved, because that was ultimately what we were driving for. What the issue is, most people lead with is, hey, we're going to build this automation to save time. And it's like, great, that's exciting, let's do it. They don't actually talk about the KPIs that need to happen. So I just really appreciate that this particular graph that kind of showcases how that is successful. It was successful by asking questions like, what do we need to do to be successful for this automation to actually work? What are the pain points, right? Some of the pain points were accuracy in the emails, actually having it produce emails every single time. And some of the risks were things might feel a little impersonal, right? So we were able to get all that onto the table before we spent all this work developing. And I can admit and tell you, in past lives, I've watched initiatives happen in the reverse, which burn a lot of money and create a lot of attrition because people are upset that these systems didn't work, even though they were kind of set up to fail from the start. So this KBI is so important to getting us to the KPIs we want. But again, it kind of requires some tough conversations around asking tough questions and identifying some of the risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of this is learning your way into what the right behaviors are.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a case where a healthcare organization had implemented a brand new technology that was giving them really great early warning surveillance on patients, so they could be thinking about where folks might be trending in a way that's going to require, better clinical intervention. And so one of the things that they had, they got nifty, they had their monitors everywhere, they were having a huddle, right? So now, nurses are meeting in these huddles. And even though they had all of this in place, they had great data, they had great visualization, they had a practice of huddles, they still weren't able to get folks to bring up some of the issues that were happening. And so I think about like one of the key behaviors that you see here on this slide, which I think is really important, is, the behavior was, let's admit mistakes. So easy to say, like, sure, but especially as you think about healthcare setting. So think about this for a moment. So healthcare setting, you've got clinicians who have gone through training where they are not allowed to make mistakes. And you're in a setting where if you make a mistake, it creates harm. So the idea of making mistakes sounds really great in theory, but really scary in practicality. So how do you do that? And so one of the things I realized is we have these practices, we have this great technology, but we're still not getting folks feeling psychologically safe enough. The environment didn't feel like folks are going to be able to speak up. So this behavior right here was coupled with a practice. And at this huddle, they said, you know what? Let's have everywhere. It doesn't have to be clinical. Once a week, we want folks, and every day we're going to just pick on different folks, at this huddle, just admit a mistake, just share something that happened for you and a lesson learned. It could be in your life. It could be, I struggled getting my kiddo out the door this morning and, forgot their lunch or whatever that looks like. And here's what I learned from, getting ready the night before, whatever that looks like. It was that constant, opportunities, small but important opportunities for folks to get used to admitting mistakes, making mistakes, and what they learn from it, that eventually get them to this place where it felt like they had this environment where folks weren't going to judge them, and they kept upping the ante. So let's talk about what this might look like in the workplace. And over about 3 months, what they started to see where a lot more nurses were willing to share what the barriers were and being able to respond to the feedback. Because when you get a surveillance system like this, the speed at which you need to react is much faster. And so, the collaboration needs to be there. So I just think about the importance of, do we have the right behaviors to drive the right actions to get the right outcomes? And that's really what this started to show us, is the power of the behavior and the practice to really drive the processes and the technology that's enabling it to get the outcome. So really huge.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, go for it, Kahlil.
I was thinking this goes right back to what Michael's saying, culture, right? I think a sense of urgency, a sense of trust, those things go really far when you're trying to do hard things. And it sounds obvious, but it shocks me how many companies don't have one or both of those things. But really just wanted to highlight that. And Christian, great example. And Colin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I think it nails something that Kahlil, you and I and our team sees all the time. We just placed a COO at a Series B company. And the irony here is with exec searches, the best candidates aren't the ones with the perfect resumes. The best candidates are the ones who consistently demonstrate feedback loops and accountability for their behaviors. And we see this time and time again. So even in the interviewing process, you want to make sure you're not just looking for the glamorous companies or the KPIs, but what's underneath that. How have they led teams? How have they structured and communicated with teams? There's a lot more data there than just their KPIs and highlights of their careers.
Right. Yeah, so important.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I had a client that did something very unique, in that they would actually do all of their interviewing on site, and it was to Colin's point. They wanted to understand how this person behaved in a group, not how they behaved over a one-on-one Zoom and answered questions. They wanted to see how they answered things. They wanted to see different teammates interact with them. So I think we're adopting KBIs, but I don't think companies have the structure or again the language to go about really defining these things. So I don't want to underscore simplicity on this. I think that's the value that Intentional Futures brings, is breaking this down to a simplistic yet really direct understanding of why this is so important, because we're doing these things in our personal lives. You mentioned it, Christian, like we're doing these things often, and we tend to forget that when we step into the organization because other things are coming into play. So just wanted to really underscore the importance of being able to start small and how powerful the wins start to be. And we've seen it at our own firm as well.
I love all those examples. Let me build on that, because I think you're getting at a number of things. One is that these behaviors need to be super clear, visible. Chris used the metaphor of like, I need to be able to take my phone out and record you. What are you saying? What are you doing? And is that exhibiting the behavior we're talking about? So there's a translation of these things to very specific contexts and roles that's important. And you can get your teams to participate in defining that with you, but that you get really clear. This isn't mushy. This is like, are you doing it or not? Are you doing it well or not? And how does that actually drive performance and the outcomes we're talking about? Working your way into them is important too. You don't want to just rip the Band-Aid off and announce we're suddenly just doing things in an entirely different way. Let's go, everybody. And they get frustrated and punish people if they're not coming along. You're talking about consistency, Kahlil, and like maybe starting small and growing out, and you're like socializing, improving it to people over time. And that's how change can happen. It can happen more quickly than you think, but you got to be consistent and really clear. And then behind all of this is the why. And you were alluding to it even in your example about recording meetings. We want to become more efficient and save you time. The way we're going to do that is by recording every meeting, so we can use automated summaries that for these emails. And then all you have to do is very quickly correct them and send it out at the end of the day. We want that to become our daily practice. That's how we're going to see efficiency gains, and you'll probably like your jobs more.
Yeah, and I'm first to raise my hand and say we did that process imperfectly, and I think through that's where the next adoption that's a little more complicated, like automated, agentic sourcing, things like that, right? We're able to learn and go through it tactically, just like how you outlined it. So just want to be the first to raise my hand and say, like, we made a lot of mistakes in that, but now having gone through this exercise with you all and really seeing this firsthand, it really pays in spades to simplify and slow down a bit and get really candid and clear with what's working, what's not, and invite the teams in. So couldn't have said it better myself, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the way that you're framing it there, Kahlil, is I think going to be true for everyone on this journey, which is we're going to have to learn our way into what these behaviors are. And they may shift over time, but we're still going to have to learn our way into them. And that's, I think, an important part of this. So, we're going to share, what it looks like to get started on this journey here in this next little bit, what it looks like to actually craft what we call a key behavior blueprint. And so as we speak, just know we're sharing the roadmap here, but the practice, as I mentioned, this is complex. Meaning that it's not fixable. It means that you have to continuously manage to it. So you're continuously coming back and asking, are these the right behaviors? Are these the right practices? So we say there's two starting points. One is, can you define those key behaviors? And again, I want to make sure key behaviors, so those 20% of behaviors that are driving the outcomes, really important. And then two, are you able to identify and then codify those core practices? They're going to systematically reinforce those behaviors. So really important. And as we do that, one of the things that we always introduce to organizations to help build some Visual alignment, especially across the leadership team, or if it's a cross-functional team, is what we call a key behavior blueprint summary. And so that's what you're seeing here on your screen. I'm more than happy to share this with you, after today as well. And what we're doing here is trying to unpack a few things so that folks feel like what their behaviors are that they end up landing on are connected to something. So we always start with, what is the strategic outcome that you're striving to attain? That's really important. If you don't know what the outcome is, you just have behaviors, then it really is difficult to come back to where you just talked about, Michael, that why are we doing this? Because it sounds like it's important, but really, like, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve, and why is that important to both us as a team and those that we serve? So whatever that looks like. Two, we want to really unpack who is going to be involved in these behaviors. Is it everyone? Are there leadership teams? Is it a cross-functional team? Is it a department? There may be slightly different behaviors for different groups. There may be leadership behaviors to support what's happening at the point of work versus, Kahlil, your example is really great of a set of behaviors to drive a process, which is at a different altitude, right? And of course, the behaviors themselves and the practices. So that's what goes on here. And as we do that, we always say the starting point is, do we know the outcomes? And then let's talk for a minute. We were just with a group about a month ago, and they're embarking in a large change. And part of what they talked about is we need to be one team. We need to be adaptive. And the executive group, which is about 30 folks, bringing in folks from across the country, had never actually aligned on what that looked like. So getting a chance to actually build out some kind of thesis and statement to be able to say, what would people be saying? What would they be doing? You don't have to be, super concrete yet, but what does that look like? What is that environment? That's a really important starting point for all of this, is making sure that folks are able to just begin to verbalize that, visualize that, express that, and align, so that they know that that's the environment that they are responsible for. They're either going to enable it or they're going to, constrain it. So that's a really big starting point for all this.
Let me chime in with one thought, because it dawns on me that this could sound like being top-down prescriptive. Like we're literally being like, you need to say these things and behave this way, and this is how we manage culture. And what we actually mean is the opposite. What we're talking about is being really tangible and clear about what behaviors, and having a common idea of what does that actually look like, and what's the why behind that? What do we think that'll result in? And then there's the huge amount of agency and creativity that everyone can have in terms of saying, this is how I apply that idea in this situation and in my particular role. And so this can actually be energizing and exciting for people. It's making whenever you show up in an organization, it doesn't take you long to figure out what the culture is like. It's because people are going to be like, hey, this is how we do things here. And they will send you subtle and not so subtle cues on how you need to show up and succeed in this place. And you may or may not agree with all those things, but when you make it explicit like this, then it's not going to be subverted by anyone, and it's all out in the open. And then you can actually activate people so they can understand what you're trying to do and why. And I think that's way more inspiring.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think in these exercises, again, I wish I had these blueprints, which we're using kind of going forward. But again, a lot of the times what we see, which is exciting, is it exposes things we didn't initially think it would expose. Like we come in with this crystal clear idea. And for example, we learned that our organization in this area is very reactive, which is where some of the tension is coming from with changing the behaviors, because people feel like, hey, we actually can't do this because we're already drowning in behind. That exposes something completely different that then we'll need to go and run and do. And so that's also something to keep in mind, is probably 9.9 times out of 10, I'll let you guys tell me, you go in with an intention to change and make these changes, but it's going to expose things that maybe you hadn't ever thought of and create whole new initiatives. So I would always say stay open-minded here, and also be ready to pivot to something that maybe looks different but accomplishes the same goal. But I agree, like having dynamicness, not being super rigid, and inviting dialogue in, whether you like it or not, and I'm mainly talking to the leaders, is absolutely critical. At my time at Nike, I saw the opposite. And, we would see us trying to shift the behaviors, but at the end of the day, there was someone gatekeeping the ability to change that behavior. And so I think startups have a really exciting opportunity to be dynamic and nimble and to test things and break things quickly. I mean, that's why, startups are the backbone of a lot of what we do in entrepreneurship. So really appreciate this simple breakdown, but also appreciate the point being made of stay dynamic and really lean on your teams here.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to piggyback off that, Kahlil, because I think you've nailed it. The reason why startups have a competitive advantage is innovation. And why that occurs is culture and behavioral traits. And so, one thing I think we'd really press on startups to be thinking about is that you can't automate what you can't define. So a lot of times companies from top down are wanting to implement AI platforms, KBIs, without being able to define what they're looking for. So I think that's number one of something we should be thinking about. And something else to be thinking about is AI doesn't replace behavior, it amplifies it. So meaning, again, what you can't really automate some of these processes without defining it, and not defining it from top down, but within your organization and within teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, the amplification of behaviors is spot on, and I'll use myself as the joke. I didn't realize how much control I had over the emails I was sending. There was a bit of that behavioral that me and Colin had to talk about, where it was like, okay, we're using this automation. I need to relinquish some of the perfectionism in sending emails. I mean, that's a behavior that's tough to admit, but I admitted it here. I'll admit it in front of my teams. And what that led to is other people saying, you know what, that was my resistance to this too. And so now we can move forward into knowing that that is a piece of our culture that we'll want to address and build space around so people can make those adjustments. But Colin, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we see that also on the hiring side of the house with agentic agents today. It's not getting you better candidates, it's amplifying the candidates you're already attracting, which is something we're seeing in drones. So just really couldn't appreciate that take more.
Yeah, that's so, all of this is like just so rich, when we're having these conversations, whether they're with a team, whether we're going to be starting with a team, like an executive team, and then trying to get employee voice so that we're understanding how are folks framing the language, how are they seeing things. We always come to this point in the conversation where we ask, okay, we have an idea about the kind of environment, the culture that's needed here. Do we need to have greater sensitivity to operations, greater situational awareness? Do we need to, have a, sharper, connection to experimentation, whatever that might look like. And inevitably where we get to, which comes closer to where your conversation went, is the simple question, what are the must-have and can't-have behaviors? So what are the must-have behaviors that would help enable this environment that you're talking about, and what are the can't-have behaviors that would completely undermine it? And folks I find they're really good, and the list is always long of the can't-haves, right? Blaming, gossip, silo behavior. Like, they're really good at it. And then they sit there and look at the column, and they're like, what are the must-have behaviors? And they come up with some really good stuff, which I think is really helpful. But it starts to really, cue in the conversation, because oftentimes what we start to see are the must-have behaviors are still a little conceptual. They might sound like we need to have greater empathy. We need to be more collaborative. We need to have greater curiosity. And Michael, you mentioned this earlier, because this is a really important starting point. And we want folks, and we're bringing folks along. We want folks to nod their head. We want folks to share their anecdotes, talk about what it's like today, where things might not feel collaborative or transparent. And where we want to get them to is this next piece in this blueprint, which is, okay, let's define it. Like, what would someone be doing if they were curious? What would someone be doing if they were going to show empathy? What would someone be doing if they were going to be a bit more experimental? What does that look like? And so that's, I think, really the exciting part of this work, is getting to that place. And Michael, you said it. So I usually like to give the example. I'm going to pull out my phone and I'm going to hit the record button. And I want a behavior that I can either record with my video camera, or I can record with my voice recorder. Like, what is someone going to be doing or saying that we can reinforce? And that's, I think, the beauty of this, because that gives us an opportunity then to ask, which a lot more clarity now, how consistently is this actually happening today? Because it's really difficult to measure a concept, but a lot easier to begin to see if someone's admitting a mistake, sharing a lesson learned, making their work visible, sharing ideas with others, including somebody who's not speaking up in a conversation, whatever that might look like, right? So that's what we want to get to with all of this, which I think is really important.
Yeah, Christian, I think you nailed it. One thing we see consistently across our portco, the most successful companies, they celebrate failure. They don't try to hide it. You want to reinforce and reward consistency over perfection. And we see that in a lot of cultures where they just want perfect, only perfect. And the companies that thrive not only celebrate failure, but allow people to learn from it. So it's just something we should be keeping in mind for our organizations as well.
Yeah.
I want to go on a little side note here, Colin, Kahlil. Let me ask you this, because we've encountered sometimes startups. Everyone recognizes the importance of culture. They don't always know what to do about it or how to manage. And too often when you're starting out, you're just like, I've got to get to market, get my first customer, my first dollar of revenue, the next raise, and I'll worry about this stuff later. And I think from our vantage point, that seems like a mistake, because your culture is being defined, like it or not, as you pursue those things. And so what's your take on how founders, leaders of startups think about this and the value of paying some attention and integrating it into what you do earlier than they might normally?
Yeah, I mean, I think this all comes back down to, again, not to say this a lot, but the 20% of behaviors that are driving the foundational build of your organization. I mean, just to really put it back into Christian's language, I think we don't, and I'll say we synonymously with founders and early stage startup founders, there's so much happening that you're drowning in the 80%. I will say I've been in that environment. I'll probably be there again as we continue to scale up. So really being intentional about building this into your culture is huge. I think it comes back down to knowledge. So I think being curious, being on webinars like this, really understanding what is a key behavioral indicator? What are those vital behaviors as myself as a leader? What is the 20% of things I'm doing to set up my culture, to set up my technology, to deliver, most importantly, a great client or customer experience? I think really slowing down and defining that. I don't see that enough. I think especially in tech, everyone's so in love with their tech that they kind of forget about everything else. And to your point, when you come to that mindset of like, I'll deal with this later, it's just like rebuilding a house. Once you've already built the foundation, you have to tear it all down again. And in a lot of cases, what ends up happening is they're building multiple homes around their primary at that point. And that leads to silos, that leads to a lot of dysfunction. And so really having the honest take of starting at the foundational level is important. And just giving you guys your kudos, you really had us think about even where we are in an early stage when we're still, really scaling. We've really had to slow down and say, what is that 20% that's key to what we're doing in the relationships that we're building? For us, it's how we approach and manage those relationships. That's why I gave the post follow-up piece. We're a relationship-based business. That's really important for us to follow up promptly, to have next steps defined. That's really important to the work we do. So that's an example of really taking that 20% seriously. It's not a complicated piece of our 20%, but it's foundational. And if we didn't start there, Colin and I take 5 to 6 meetings, if not more, a day. The amount of time suck that you then multiply with our 10 team members, right? That's a lot of time spending in our relationships. And we want that, but we also want to be efficient. So again, it goes back to, it's easier to start with a good foundation than it is to rebuild once the foundation's laid.
That's great.
Yeah, Kahlil, and I think just to piggyback off you, one thing that we see often is this paralyzation where this shouldn't be complicated. Don't overcomplicate it. And what I mean by that is you should start off with one critical behavior and then build off it, like you're saying. So start with that foundation. It can be very overwhelming when you start to look at your organization and realize how much change needs to happen, but you want to start off with that foundation, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's huge. We always say, can you start with 3 or 4? 3 or 4 just key behaviors. I think, any more than that can get overwhelming. And when we do this work, it's funny. I think about the early day when you first started. The first time I ever ran a workshop with a group, we said, okay, what would be your key behaviors? And everyone just kind of looked like deer in headlights. And where we've gotten to, today, after visiting so many organizations, we have over 70 key behaviors that we've taken from organizations. You're just seeing like just a picture of some of these cards, and it's really great for folks to come in and look at the behaviors that are going to amplify high reliability or standardization or experimentation, whatever that might look like, and be able to just adopt and adapt for their organization and their language. So it's like, just a fast track to be able to get what these key behaviors might be, and then be able to actually turn them into an indicator really quickly to find out, great, we've aligned on these. Now, how consistently are these happening? So I just think being able to have folks in a room, whether it's digitally, we have these in a Miro, or whether it's, in physical form and have the card deck. I think this is, one of the favorite things that people have, because they're like, oh, this behavior, this is what I've been trying to put into words, and it's right here, because another organization's already thought about it, which I think is great.
Yeah, it comes back down to that acumen side of the house. I think when I look at these cards, like choose an owner mindset is something Colin and I have said from day one. That's the culture. That's part of the culture that we built and established. We want people to be self-starters. The onus isn't on the people to figure that out and do it. And that's a really easy trick to fall into. The onus is on us to define that and to give structure to people with that owner mindset. Give them, the confidence and reassurance that they can make mistakes, that they can truly own something. And it goes way deeper than that. But I think just even recognizing that alone, that it's a shared responsibility to make sure these behaviors are done correctly is critical. I think, Michael, you mentioned that as well. I think from the C-suite, historically, even at the startup level, it's usually, you can establish this kind of us versus them culture unintentionally when you put all of the onus of the behaviors onto your teams. When you really show by action and show them how you're leading and adopting these things, the rest kind of falls into place once you've kind of given some thought to it as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because I think, as we're, near the end of our time, what you just said is really important, because the next piece here, and it's almost like, people have talked to each other when they come to these workshops that we put on, because they'll say, okay, great, we've got these key behaviors. Now what? Like me and my leadership team are aligned, but how do we get everybody else aligned in this? And we know that just communicating out is going to have a really small impact on people internalizing these behaviors. Mm-hmm. Modeling is amazing. And yet it even has still a really small impact on how folks are going to really internalize this. So there's something that you started this whole presentation with that we're going to end with here, which is, how do you embed practices now, and not add new work, but embed practices to reinforce these behaviors? Everything's about, have we set the right targets? Do we know why we're doing this? And those targets don't just have to be, a KPI. We really believe that they should also be a KBI, because these are really good lead indicators to what you're trying to achieve. So let me give you a quick example of what this sounds like in practice. So an organization that we got a chance to take a look at, and then they've been informing how we work with folks. They had really simple core behavior. They want folks to make mistakes and learn from them. That's it, right? So we've talked about that earlier, but this is more broadly, make mistakes and learn from them. Very meeting heavy organization. They're distributed, they're remote. So let me give you 4 practices that they use to embed into their day-to-day. So one is, at the start of every meeting, they have what's called a daily story, where folks get a chance to share, similar to what I shared with the healthcare example, where folks are just going to share a quick example of a mistake that maybe they made and what they learned from it. Really quick, obvious. Oftentimes it might be leader-led, but want to get folks involved small, and then they get going. Now, there might have an opportunity for a conversation that show up in the meeting, and rather than saying, oh, what do people think about this? They're going to do what's called a round robin. So they're going to go around and ask each person, let me just hear your first draft thinking. And I want you to hear first draft thinking. If you don't have something to say, that's fine. You can hit pass. And then we're going to open up the conversation. Why would they do that? They're going to have a conversation anyways, but they want to give folks a small opportunity to practice, again, making a mistake. It's first draft thinking. And that's okay, because we're going to build on it, right? So we're creating the safety for that. Participation goes up, risk goes down. So they have these small little moves that are just embedded into what they do. Once a week, they have something called Mistake Monday, where they take 5 or 10 minutes at the very end of their all hands. And what they do is they get into pairs or trios, and everybody shares what's one thing that they've done in the last week that they wish they could have done even better. Maybe it was how they led a meeting, how they designed an agenda, if they forgot to include somebody, in some decision making, and then they share. They actually vote on the best fail of the week, which is interesting, right? Which I think is pretty fun. And then once a quarter, they have what's called a failabration. So the celebration of failures. And this one is actually executive led. And they bring folks together to share what that looks like. So I just want to piece that together for you. Again, they have this core behavior of we're going to make mistakes and learn from them. This is global. And then they have these embedded practices, daily stories, round robins, Mistake Monday, failabrations that are there to help reinforce not just how the leader is going to model this, but how everybody is going to get a chance to participate in this. And I think that's really important to call out. This is how you scale reinforcing these really important behaviors so that they become a business process inside of your organization that you can now manage. It becomes much more concrete instead of something that's just something that one leader is going to try to lead the charge around.
I love all of that, Chris, and it has me thinking about the context of AI adoption and applying all of this, which is sort of what our focus here. And it's, let's just note that it is an unknown. This is an emerging, fast-moving technology. Nobody yet knows exactly what its potential is, how it's going to coexist and enable people, where it's going to replace people, what it can automate, etc. We are all on a learning journey, and it's fast and it's scary. All of this applies to that adoption. And we've seen many stories where leaders are like, there's a mandate now. I'm frustrated. People aren't using it. Well, use it or I'm going to fire you. You know?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like a model way to run a company, but it's an expression of frustration and urgency and the desire to get an org to actually move forward. What we're talking about here is much better ways that organizations can experiment with KBIs as a way to drive productive adoption and receptivity. And there's a lot of dimensions to this. You need to have a why. You need to name the reasons why people would resist it. Help them identify that. There's a lot of fear. Am I training, my successor who's going to automate me out of a job? Yeah. Is this diminishing the value of all the skills I've worked for 20, 30 years to develop? Is there a pride of authorship, like you're talking about, Kahlil, in the email? And I consider that part of my identity and what makes me excellent at what I do. So many reasons, and it's going to get very personal very quickly. But if you start to go through a process here and say, hey, let's all figure this out together. We know there's great potential. We know it's complex and dynamic. It's going to be changing. We're going to be experimenting and learning quickly, and applying some of these approaches to make it feel safer, make it feel more interesting and exciting, and learn your way collectively towards what's going to work well so you can get the most out of it. And I love the examples. And Kahlil, you were talking about it, like it amplifies culture and behavior, right? Because if you're using it well, it's sort of scaling an individual and their, the terrain of impact that they might have. And so you've got kind of two dimensions of this. What are the behaviors that are going to foster creative experimentation and adoption in ways that actually help advance your organization's goals?
Yeah.
And you've got when people are in those, it's going to be amplifying certain characteristics of behavior. And some of that's going to be awesome. And some of that is going to be surprising in a bad way. And you're going to have to make some adjustments.
Yeah, I really appreciate that recap. And I would even go further to say, strategically, we really balance this out. I think one of the big items to just walk away with is just because everyone is running towards AI adoption doesn't mean that that's necessarily right for your organization at this moment. And so the exercises we went through today are going to expose whether you're ready or not. And I think it's okay to start slow and really build the KBI practices, to really build these rituals and routines before you throw, AI first into your organizational initiative. So there's no shame in that. It doesn't mean you're behind. To Michael's point, this is one big experiment happening right now. So I think it's also important to have that counterweight of, sometimes it's just better to start with focusing on, is my foundation solid before I start to throw this other factor in on top of it, just like any other initiative. So Michael and Christian, really appreciate the conversation, because I think on both sides, whether you're ready or not, there's actionable things you can take away from today.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe how fast the time has flown. Definitely there's a lot of headlines here. Hopefully there's a lot of takeaways. Again, as we're doing this work, we've been blessed with the opportunity to be given access to so many different organizations who have given us their core practices, their routines. And so we've just been trying to share these with other folks as well. So sharing these key behaviors, sharing these core practices, and as Michael mentioned, just wanting folks to test these out in their organizations, seeing the difference that it makes for them. And we're here as a resource. We're here as a guide. And, we consider this still an important learning journey for us. I think we've, been able to hone in on a point of view and have a pretty good idea about, how to get started with this journey, but it's dynamic, it's complex. And so it's going to require, an ongoing commitment to understanding what this looks like. So, just appreciating this conversation today with you guys and appreciating folks who tuned in, and really hope that folks are feeling like they can come our way and ask us some questions as well, because we want to see this. We want to see KBIs as something that's used, across organizations. We don't just know, we've seen the importance and the impact that it can have when folks are actually able to understand how much more collaborative, how much more transparent, how much more communicative their teams can be by being able to implement some of this and being able to bring it to life so they can actually work on it together. Michael, Colin, Kahlil, I know we're just about out of time. Any last words of wisdom here before we close up?
No, just really appreciate today's conversation. Start with where you are and what you know, and build foundationally step by step. And don't forget about those KBIs because they're going to drive the success of your KPIs.
Love it. All right.
Appreciate you guys.
Wise words.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.